How important is the notion of health and wellbeing in schools? Should schools simply stay in their traditional lanes and avoid this topic altogether? Or should they play a key role in the lives of learners in how they develop their health and wellbeing? And if you agree with the latter point, then to what extent should teachers be responsible for the health and wellbeing of their students? And when is it better to defer this responsibility to trained healthcare professionals or to the child's parents or carers? And what about teachers? Surely after a global pandemic and major teacher shortages across many countries in the world, their wellbeing is also vitally important. What's being done about that? Well, in this podcast, I cover these questions and more with my guest, Associate Professor John Quach, who has spent the best part of 15 years researching at the nexus of health and education. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Powerful Learning Podcast. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, where our mission is to help you know more, do more, and be more by delving into the science of effective learning and teaching. My name's Luke Rowe, and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the health and well-being of students and teachers has been thrust into the spotlight. Those who previously argued that school was simply a place to learn about the 3 R's like reading, writing and arithmetic have been proven woefully wrong. Why? At least part of the answer to this question is because the health and well-being of the students acts as a gateway to their learning. A student who doesn't want to be at school, who feels anxious and on edge, who feels abandoned and alienated by their educational context is also a student who is likely to struggle with their academic pursuits and even give up on their schooling altogether. Fortunately, there are educators and researchers who are teaming up to see how they can tackle these wickedly challenging problems. And one of those researchers and educators is Associate Professor John Quach. John has built his career at the interface of health and education, having first trained as a scientist and researcher at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, then expanding his career as an academic at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. One of the reasons I've found John's career so intriguing is because he's been ahead of the curve. He's positioned himself for the last 15 years at the forefront of a movement towards cultivating better health and well-being in schools well before the pandemic even started. Not only is John a truly accepting and kind-hearted human being, but he's also a research rock star and somebody whose career I've looked up to for quite a while. He's published over 100 scholarly works in some of the most prestigious journals in both health and education, covering topics from working memory, ADHD and neurodiversity, the importance of sleep in education and brain development, literacy and numeracy, school transitions, mindfulness interventions, and general health and well-being among students and teachers. And while his career may seem incredibly eclectic and broad, he underpins all of this with a common thread in that he does so much of his research using large-scale randomized controlled trials, which have historically been very rare in educational research. In this podcast, John and I discuss his current research in Australian schools. We focus on health and well-being and how this educational evidence can be implemented at scale to help inform teaching and learning, as well as the health and well-being of students, teachers, and the broader school community. I really hope you enjoy this discussion, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to hear more of our Powerful Learning podcasts in the future. So without further ado, I bring you my discussion with Associate Professor John Quach. John Quach, g'day.
How are you?
Great. Good to have you on the podcast. It's been a long anticipated podcast discussion to be had, and I'm grateful to have you here. You've got an eclectic career, and I'm very intrigued in it because it kind of acts as a forerunner for where I want to go with a lot of my career interests as well. So, you've been quite an inspiration to me. This opportunity, I think, is going to be good for the listeners who are interested in education and where it's going with things like the scientific method being introduced into education and the wellbeing movement that we've started to see. Some have called it a wellbeing revolution, and you're certainly at the forefront of that. And also in terms of large-scale trials in classrooms, there's a movement and a push towards data from classrooms and large-scale randomized control trials. And again, you're at the front of the bandwagon there. So it's going to be really interesting to dive into some of that. But before we do, I thought you could share a little bit about your professional background and what attracted you to the field of education.
Sure. So I would see myself as a career academic, where back in the day I was someone who studied the brain and studied how our minds worked, and that I always had an interest in kind of thinking about children and thinking about how do we ensure that they have the best outcomes possible. And it wasn't until I did my PhD at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute that I really had the opportunity to look at research in that area. So before then, I had a lot of experience volunteering for various organizations working with young children and supporting them both academically, but wellbeing side as well. But when I got to my PhD, it was an opportunity for me to think about how do we design interventions or strategies that will support their ongoing development. Also, how do we know what is actually working, and what are the potential ways that we might be able to use, or what are the tools that we can use to understand that?
And was your interest primarily in like primary school age or pre-primary school age, early childhood sort of age group, or was it more broad than that?
It was very much in the kind of 0 to 8 year space.
Yep.
So really think about those early foundational years in preschool, but also those foundational years in when they reach kind of primary school as well.
Yeah. So the crucial developmental years were very important to you, definitely, and your research interests.
We know that there's so much research out there showing about how those are the years where they're really foundational, and that you start as a young child learning the skills to see the world, but also to how you might navigate different situations that you come across as well. Things around their mental health, their cognition, the way they make friends, or how they might engage with adults. A lot of those skills are built early on through experience, through role modeling, but through also being taught some of the fundamental skills that are related to that.
And so what was your PhD focusing on in that area?
Yeah, so my PhD was around sleep. So looking at the relationship between sleep and children's early academic and wellbeing outcomes, and that I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to design an intervention that we were then able to test as part of my PhD. And then we were subsequently able to get funding, and we were able to, I guess, influence the Victorian government, where the measure that I tested in that is now part of practice for the school nursing workforce. So every child starting school in Victoria will be asked about their sleep, and that if a sleep problem is identified, they will hopefully receive a evidence-based program.
So you've got your fingerprints on a pretty crucial validated instrument that's gone out to a lot of schools and children out there.
Yeah, and it really also opened my eyes that it's not very often that we will have a new idea or have a brand new approach that no one has thought about. But what we often forget to do is actually say, all right, what's happening in this area more broadly, and how do we might repackage that or deliver that to a different cohort? So sleep is a classic example where psychologists, pediatricians have a really strong history of evidence-based strategies that they can provide to families whose child's not sleeping very well, mostly behavior type approaches. But no one was actually providing that in a setting where we reach most children, which was school. So I took...
So it was bridging the gap between the theory and the practice at scale that was really appealing to you.
Yeah, and taking best practice in health, but then how do we actually apply that in an education setting, and almost, created a context-specific resource.
Oh, look, that is the golden pathway that I'm trying to wrestle with a lot of my research, because having health science background myself as well prior to education, I see so much potential for evidence-informed practices, but often there is a not so clear-cut pathway between the theory and practice in the educational space in terms of that kind of evidence. So it's interesting to hear that you were wrestling with a similar kind of challenge. So let's just step back a little bit and look at your career from a bird's eye perspective. You've got plenty of projects going on now, and I was looking at your research profile, and it's pretty impressive. And I've seen projects on mindfulness and well-being, school transitioning, sleep. So can you give us a quick snapshot just from a bird's eye view of what projects you're involved in at the moment?
Yeah, so a lot of my projects are what I call, they're related to scaling. So looking at how do we provide promising interventions at scale.
So that's a common thread that ties a lot of these different interests together.
Yeah, and a lot of that is my passion that we need to take to ensure that whatever we do at a broader level has a really strong evidence base. But also we know that there are a lot of really great programs that teachers have created or different organizations have created, and that we need to support them to look at, actually, do these interventions remain effective when more people are doing it, essentially? So that's where a lot of my research focus is, and I'm working with people, but also programs that I've developed to take that pathway between an idea to something you can put hand on your heart and say, actually, I believe every teacher should be engaged with this, or every school should be engaged with this.
Given the strength of the evidence and the extent to which you can have faith in evidence, you're considering from a probabilistic perspective where your next best steps should be.
Yeah.
So in terms of the projects that are taking up most of your time right now, give us a quick sort of flavour of what they are.
So one project is the Mindset Play study. So this is a project that I'm leading and received funding from the Australian Research Council for. And in this study, we're looking at, can we upskill primary school teachers, so in particular teachers in grade 1 and 2, to around kind of mindfulness strategies and activities they might be able to do in their classroom. And that through delivering these activities to children, can we actually see improvements in the students' attention skills, their executive functioning, but also their behaviour, as well as the well-being of their families as well, and the teachers. So that's kind of one intervention, and it's really about building teacher capacity in the area. It's quite an interesting one, because we actually want teachers towards the end of our kind of 12-week support, we want them to actually start deviating away from our manual and creating their own mindfulness activities. That's one we've purposely built, that we want them to deviate away. The second project we have is the Mental Health in Primary Schools initiative. So this was an initiative that we've been working on for the last 3 years around how do we support primary schools.
So this is pre-pandemic?
We started it we started pre-pandemic. The idea started in 2019, but then a lot of our research was happening during the pandemic as well.
Yeah. So, but you were ready. You hit the ground running.
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. Often it's about being the right person at the right time to make impact. And we were definitely, the timing was, we were around, we were doing this work, and that we had the right partnerships to be able to, I guess, influence the government to enable this to occur. As well. So
what you're saying, John, is that for me to replicate your career, I need to get lucky, basically, and have all my stars align. No. Taking out of context.
I actually do think that often most ideas, time will come. It's being ready enough when that time comes to be able to act quickly and to influence quickly as well. And that often.
What was the Victor Hugo saying? He said, nothing is as powerful as an idea that's time has come, I think.
Yeah.
Right. So that's project number 2. And
yeah.
that's a longitudinal piece. So 3 years, you're saying.
Yeah, it's been 3 years, and that in early this year, or early 2022, the state government announced $200 million in funding for the statewide rollout of the program. So
It's a very large pie, and you got a piece of that pie with your the extension of this project, right?
Yeah, 1,800 schools over between 2023 and 2026 will be trained in how they trained and increase their capacity to support the mental health of their students. So,
and this is based on the success of I will use the inverted quotes, your pilot, which was actually quite big, right? So tell us how it started and how it got to 1,800 schools.
It started much smaller than the pilot, actually. It started with an idea and a group there were 6 or 7 of us who just met up in a room, and we thought, actually, mental health in schools is a really important issue. It was even before the pandemic, and that we just think, all right, what's the best way for us to address this? And that I think this pathway also shows the value of different types of research and how you bring them together. And that the first thing we did was we ran focus groups, about 3 to 4 focus groups with primary schools teachers. And the main premise was, what are you currently doing, and what do you think would be the ideal way that you can be supported to support the mental health of their students? So that was focus groups that we conducted back in 2019, and that we also ran a survey of, and we had about 900 respondents across Victoria of more teachers and educators, and really asking what do you need? And I think that's a really important foundation that really set us up for success, was that we weren't going in as academics saying we are the experts, we're going to design something and then go test it. It's really co-designed, driven by our engagement and resources.
You didn't tell them what they wanted. You listened to what they wanted.
Exactly. And that we took those qualitative and kind of cross-sectional surveys and then put together options, and we went back to them again and said, here are the options, and really seeing what gravitated towards them. As well as at that same time, we engaged with principals and with the Department of Education and with any stakeholder who would want to listen to us, because we really wanted to design something that could be embedded and sustained within education.
In a very complex context where, and you said stakeholders, and there are many of them in education. It sounds like you were under no false impressions about how complex that space was, and you went in there with your eyes opened, having listened to many different stakeholders' perspectives.
Yep, and that we kind of had things that we changed, like we had things that we had to throw out, but things that we brought in. And I think all that engagement, and that was a lot of qualitative research, really informed the final design of what we tested. And then we did a kind of pre-post study with 10 schools where we provided them with the training, the mental health and wellbeing coordinator in schools, which was a dedicated educator whose sole role was to build the capacity of the school and to coordinate the care pathways for the children. And, that's a point of contention as well, where people are like, why aren't you putting in an allied health person? Why aren't you putting in other workforces? Why a teacher? And that stems back from our focus groups, where teachers were telling us that they want someone who really knows a school, how a school works, the politics, the functioning, and the best person to do that is another teacher. So,
isn't that interesting? I've heard, I read an article recently, I can't remember who the author was, but it was putting the spotlight on the debate between the teaching workforce having to be professionals of many different backgrounds and areas of expertise. They've got their psychology and counselling hat. They've got their kind of straightforward pedagogical tasks, and then they've got the sort of classroom management perspective. They've got to be able to engage with the families. They've got to look at the physical health and well-being of their students, and then there's the cultural diversity aspect. There's so many things going on in the classrooms now, and the teachers are expected to be experts of all of those things. And in the debate that I was seeing emerge from this article was, at what point does the profession try and become everything and therefore become nothing? Do we then diminish the profession if we expect too much of them? But what you're saying is actually that's a false dichotomy, that you can actually empower teachers and then they can make those decisions in context and in real time and make those judgments themselves.
I would probably push back even in a different way. So I think the argument you're making is about the role of a teacher, and I would actually broaden and say, what's the role of the school, and how do we ensure the right resources, the right structure is in place within schools? And that could be about having personnel, could be about having the space that can support children's learning and well-being generally, and that we need to be really careful about how much we ask educators to do. Because as you said, they're really busy. They have a lot of things that they haven't received training for. And that's kind of part of the premise of the mental health and wellbeing, is that we want teachers have a certain capacity. We want them to have a certain role, but we don't want them to do everything. And I think we want them to, in our schools, that teachers are the first to know if a child may be experiencing something that is different in terms of their well-being. We want them to be able to know which resource in their school they can pull in to support that child, to enable them to initiate the process of either getting to being assessed or getting referrals to other services.
Yeah, so they don't need to be the savior of every situation. They can actually, the power and the knowledge there is to know where their limits are and where to call and who to call on for help.
Yeah, and in line of that as well, like even once the child started that referral process, we want them to know, actually, given in my classroom, my context, what are the things I can do now that is part of good practice to support that child even whilst they're waiting for a referral to occur? Because we know that can take weeks to months within schools. So we really don't want them to, I guess, pass on the child to someone else to...
and get stuck in a holding pattern where things get worse.
Yeah, and we know that the power of, like from our mindfulness study, we know the power of language. So just even how you might talk to a child, or the type of messaging you might have in just general classroom interactions, can be a really good way to support children's mental health and support their well-being. So there are kind of very simplistic things that can occur that often we don't even realize are potentially strategies that teachers can employ.
There can potentially little things that can have potential large effects and benefits, like ripple effects.
Yeah. And like just having teachers being able to, I guess, verbalize their own emotions, or kind of acknowledging a student's emotions, is a really powerful way for saying, oh, okay, that's what I'm feeling, and these are potential strategies I might do within this situation. So we often talk about that there is no bad emotions, that we all should validate that we feel different things at different times. And it's kind of how do you react within that? That is a really important thing. That's where teachers can be supporting students in the classroom to be able to recognize their emotions and then to support them, whether through modeling or through just talking to them about, actually, how do we deal when we're feeling with these things? So
I love that. The idea that there are no bad emotions is not in keeping with a lot of the cultural misconceptions about emotions. You know, we try to shield ourselves from experiencing certain emotions because, you know, I think that there's a sense of vulnerability admitting that you're feeling terrible. You're having a sad or a blue day, and we felt a lot of these emotions during COVID, but it wasn't always in keeping with polite discussion to bring those to the surface of conversation. And what you're saying is that if emotions themselves are not good or bad, but it's the response to them that determines the value of those emotions. So there's a really important skill to be had in being able to identify what the emotions are with a degree of precision. What you're saying is the teacher plays a powerful role in modeling that and normalizing that, and giving their students a language, a framework around that pattern of identification and responding.
Yeah, and it really one of my favorite movies that I recommend for both in professional development, but also if you're a parent, is Inside Out. Like,
Yeah, I was going to say
it's
inside out.
greater. Like we use that as part of we refer to it during our mindfulness intervention. Like it's a great way to show that emotions shape who we are. And it's part of understanding what they are and what happens when you feel different things.
I did a bit of going down the rabbit hole of finding out what the background story of that movie was. And I heard it was extensive research underpinning the production of that film and the writing of the script. I heard that it took, I don't know if I can remember the research that I was doing on that film, but I heard it took something like 6 years to build the full story and the script before they started playing around with it seriously and putting it into production. And there are a lot of professional points in time where they drew on professionals to have input there. So a pretty impressive film there. It's interesting to see that something good came out of Hollywood there.
And I think and I definitely think kind of the other thing that process highlights as well is, and this is a debate at the moment in terms of the mental health side and in terms of inclusive education in general, is do teachers need to know exactly what the clinical terms for things are? Like, do they need to know this is anxiety or this is children with depression, or is it about understanding what's the functioning look like? So what's the behavior that they see and what's their response to that? And I would argue that you don't need a teacher to be able to say this child has this medical condition, because I think that's just beyond their training, beyond their scope. But they can go, oh, this child, I can know something's going on. Where should I refer them, or what's their pathway?
So this gives a very concrete example to that argument that I was tapping into before about where the teacher's professional boundaries begin and end. And what you're saying is that they don't need to be diagnosticians from a medical health perspective, and they don't need that. What they are dealing with is the functional engagement of the student in the classroom and the whole person there in a social context and milieu. And they're able to work with that, and they don't need that necessary medicalized language around that to be effective in how they respond and help that student.
Yeah, and I think one resource that I've contributed a little bit to, but wasn't taking a leadership role, was, and it was led by the Royal Children's Hospital, was they developed a child's wellbeing continuum. That started off as the child mental health continuum, but we removed mental health as a specific focus and called it the children's wellbeing continuum. And it's a resource that it's available to all teachers that can use, but it gives you a sense that children can either be good, coping, struggling, or overwhelmed.
Is this your work with was it with Beyond Blue? Or the BU program?
Yeah, so BU have a version of that as well. So this is
so this is a separate project.
Yeah, so this was a separate project, but it kind of terms that teachers can actually identify really easily. Like, they know the children who are doing really good. They'll know the ones who are coping, the ones who are struggling, and then they'll definitely know the ones who are overwhelmed. And how do they respond to students in those different categories, but also understand it's a sliding scale. They're not distinct categories, as well as it's dynamic over a classroom day. So
let alone a longer period of time.
Yeah. So it's really drawing upon the teacher's expertise to know their students, but to know about, has something happened that might mean that their students might be in the struggling or coping, overwhelmed section. Is it
so they're like little, it helps them understand little red flags potentially that might be going up.
Yeah. Like, there could have been, a student could have had a really bad experience at lunchtime and they went from coping to struggling, and that the teacher can find out about what happened and support them in that aspect.
And this continuum that you've spoken of helps them identify those in their early stages, these potential warning signs, then gives them a pathway to connect to how to respond to that.
Yeah. Part of the resource you have is you can map out, is it something to do with their friendship group, to their family, to their sleep, their diet? Like, there's a whole list of things, and they kind of give potential reasons. And it just, once again, is a resource that teachers can complete and when we say complete, it doesn't have to be a sit down resource. It could be that something they just have on their desk and they go, oh, here's a student, and just visually look at and mentally complete it.
So like a thought exercise, not so much a burdensome form to fill out, more forms to fill out would not go down well with the teaching profession.
Yeah, no. And, it could be something that we even would suggest some schools just putting up in their classroom. So once again, the students can go, oh, today I'm feeling blah, and then communicate that, and opens that conversation that they might have with their teacher, or the teacher might be able to have with their family, or for older kids, they could have that conversation together.
Okay.
It's about taking away the clinical and the medical terminology, because I think
which can be a barrier in a way.
It's a real big barrier.
Yeah, and that doesn't even speak to this other unintended consequence of the use of that language, which has been very well publicised in terms of the deficit-based model / the medical model, and then the counterfactual of that, the counter view is, of course, a strength-based model, and that all ties up into the neurodiversity movement. But let's quickly circle back around. Let's circle back around to any of the other projects that you're getting involved in at the moment, because I just think it's really helpful to understand the breadth of what you're looking at, and also then to come back to that common thread, and which we'll get to soon, about what research looks like at scale and how it can help the educational profession.
Yeah. So the other one it's called the Getting It Right study, and this is a study looking at supporting primary schools to support the oral language and literacy development of their students, particularly in the grade prep to 3 space. And that it's really kind of, I guess, the next part of projects I'm doing, where it's about systems. So where we know about that there are evidence-informed approaches schools can use to support their students' oral language and their reading. What we struggle with is actually, how do we support schools to bring those pieces together? So how do they use their data to inform their choices about what to do next, and what are they doing next? So we'll have study findings in a few years' time, but it's really this next bit where we're saying, actually, we don't want to say education has no evidence. There is actually some really good evidence, whether it's actual programs or whether strategies or pedagogy. We know the evidence exists, but how do schools bring those bits together? So that's what we're trying to do in that study, is thinking about, actually, how do we support schools? And we're looking at how ready they are for the change. And I've got a PhD student who's going to exploring that, and it's got some really fascinating findings coming out.
Ooh, tantalizing. Can't wait to hear about it. So is that Getting It Right with a W-R-I-T-E, or is it R-I-G-H-T?
R-I-G-H-T.
Okay. So I thought it was a bit of wordplay there.
No,
the
not
whole
wordplay.
Oral and language literacy and all that.
Yeah, where we're looking at systems.
Yeah.
And then the other project that I'm involved in is working with Trisha Eady and being involved in evaluating the rollout of the 3-year-old kinder across Victoria.
Trisha Eady's got a background in speech pathology, doesn't she?
Yeah, speech pathology.
Yeah.
But now she is very much in early childhood. And again, we're wanting to see, this idea of 3-year-old kinder in every level makes sense and will be beneficial for young children. But we're, I guess, running a study where we'll be evaluating that, and that looking at actually what are the outcomes we see through the rollout of 3-year-old kinder, as well as how does teacher practice within those rooms influence those outcomes.
Reminds me a little bit of the E for Kids program that Dan Cloney and Colette. There was very interesting findings there, and certainly it pointed to the involvement in those programs being overall a better thing. So there's no surprises that that's your hypothesis that you want to test, because it makes sense that if you bring it down to lower age groups, you would still retain some of that benefit. But I guess explicating that so that you can, again, put your hand on your heart and say, yes, probabilistically speaking, this is where we should invest our time and efforts, and in terms of guidance for parents to understand when's the best time to send their kids off to early childhood experiences. Well, here's some evidence to suggest that might be 3 years old.
Yeah. And then the final project is the primary to, it's called the School Transition Study. And this is a classic example where this is year 1 of this project. And we're wanting to think about, actually, how do we support students who make that transition from grade 6 to high school?
Which is
And
notoriously a difficult transition to make, right? So the literature is
yeah,
pretty clear that that's a time of great vulnerability in a student's life.
yeah. So year one of that means that we've done a survey, we've done focus groups with
Survey of
young
teachers or
children,
students? Oh,
of
students
teachers,
themselves.
and then
Okay.
we did focus groups with students from grade 5 to year 8. That's getting,
So
you know,
really a multi-level study.
yeah, and really getting the voices of the students about actually what are you looking forward to, what went right, what went wrong, how can we ensure that a system is built that can ensure that students are well scaffolded for this transition, but also recognizing that transitioning is part of life and that we actually do need them to experience that transition and experience the nervousness that you might have between losing friends and making friends and a new environment. So kind of balancing up between not wanting to put them in cotton wool where they say there was no anxiety,
Yeah.
but we want them to ensure that if students are really getting whose functioning is kind of being negatively influenced by this transition, they provide with the right support and really being able to manage that. In a few weeks' time, we're meeting with our expert group and with some educators to show those findings from the students, and we'll see what we come up with.
In terms of designing interventions to help scaffold that transition, or
yeah, so we're going in with open minds as well. So it might be a program, it might be a system, it might be a menu of things. We don't know, but that's the part of my work that I really enjoy. Is like I at no time presume I am the expert ever, and it's really let's hear from the people who are working on the ground about what they need, and let's see if we can design something and evaluate it to build the evidence for that area.
Yeah, I love that you're including student voice in the research. We've often been guilty of avoiding students in the research because it sometimes makes research much more complicated. Let's face it, as researchers, the students are often protected behind layers and layers of ethical red tape, and rightfully so, of course. We need to protect those who are vulnerable and in a power dynamic where they're at the mercy of adult decisions. But at the same time, that's led to some gaping holes in the research literature where students' voices are not heard, reflected in that literature. So it's lovely to hear that you've had the empowerment of student voice to shape your study design and teacher voice as well, for that matter. So again, going back to your motto earlier, where you're not telling teachers what they want, but you're listening to them to shape how you can help them and hearing what they want. The other thing that you brought up, which is really interesting, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, this idea of safetyism, where we shield students and children too much from risk. And we've become so risk averse that it has an inverse relationship to their development and their health and well-being and ultimately the development of their resilience. It'd be fascinating to see where you go with that research in terms of where to strike that balance between being overprotective and underprotective, right? And there's some sweet spot in the middle there, perhaps. But in terms of explicating that, it's, I think, really difficult.
Yeah, and I think I really like the work of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child in this space. So they talk about it in early childhood and about brain development, but they really they categorize stress or experiences in 3 different areas. So one is your toxic stress, which
De-stress, eustress, and
no, so
no. Oh, okay,
this is
different
different.
stresses.
So
Yeah.
You've got the toxic stress. So these are the things such as being exposed to violence or to drug and alcohol, and that has really negative experiences, influence on the brain development of young children and young adults as well. So that's the toxic stress, and then we get the positive stress. So these are stressful life events, but they help you to, I guess, develop coping skills and strategies. And part of being human is having these positive stresses. And an example will be if you're sitting a test. It's stressful. We all acknowledge doing assignments can be stressful, but overall, it should be a positive experience because you either learn something through it or it's such a defined moment of time that you go, actually, hopefully you develop skills that next time you see the test, you won't be as stressed or those sorts of things. But then they have what they call as the tolerable stress. And these are stresses that can go either way in a person's life. And that it really comes back to the support structures that can support a young child through that period. For example, one example they use in some of their content is if you've got a death of a family member, it can, for some children, that can be quite a toxic experience, especially if they don't have adults around to support them or that they are modeled behaviors or things that aren't, that don't show good, I guess, mechanisms or strategies to deal with that situation. And as I said, it could be just about being able to show sadness and grief and how you deal with that. But then for other children, it is still, it's not, a positive experience, but they can potentially have learnings that can happen from that where if they learn that actually it's okay to feel sad when these things happen. It's okay to grieve at this time. Here's some strategies that I could have where I acknowledge my feelings, that I can learn to accept that this has happened, learn that this is part of life. And so, where they can actually have an experience, which is still sad. Both situations, there's likelihood to be sad, but how you've scaffold around that is really important. And I think
and there's two very distinct outcomes in how they respond. One, you can grow through it, and the other, you can just go through it. It can take away from your life.
And I think that's where teachers have such a powerful role as well, is they're part of I call the system of support that students have. Like they're part of the ecosystem that students have. So they have a role to play in, like, if a child comes back from to school after experiencing one of these, do you ignore it? Or do you acknowledge them and then support them to come back into the class? Or, if children who experience chronic illness and are they're in hospital a lot and they're in and out, once again, a teacher can ignore it, or they can actually put things in place and acknowledge it and support that child to come back or as they're learning. So you can see, it's those sliding door moments and sliding door interactions that can occur.
Oh, I love that. It's such a really good example, really powerful. It reminds me of some of the research that was done, Terry Bowles did, in regards to school belongingness and the social supports that students have and the influences of, in terms of the highest effect and the most influential to the least influential people. If you could kind of put that on a graded continuum, teachers were actually at the top of that in terms of the highest effect supports for people's social supports, and developing their resilience. Even in, I think, a couple of those studies, more so than parents, more influential than parents in determining how they cope with their social life. So that was fascinating.
Yeah, I would probably argue that it really depends on the parents, the teacher. Like, there's such a variations that I would hate to put a blanket rule saying,
the generalizations don't work.
But I really think it's another example of that complexity about what can teachers feasibly be asked to do, and recognizing that teachers play a role as part of a wider network that encompasses the child. It's got
it's not either or, is it? They can work with the parents and then step back and get other supports involved. It's a tight ecosystem of supports.
And for some children, maybe the teacher needs to do more, depending on the home environment. Maybe the teacher does step in and do more, but in others, they may not need to. And once again, that's part of the professional judgment that I think teachers should have the license to do. And I think they do a lot of this already, is that they know their students, they know which ones might need that little bit of extra support, whether it's academically, socially, that they know. And we need to trust their judgment, but we also need to keep building evidence that can help them be better at what they do.
That can inform their knowledge and skills in making those judgments.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, that's good. I think we've got a real sample of the breadth of your research there. And oh my goodness, we could have done 10 podcasts just on each of those. You've really caught my interest there. Let's talk about how the notion of a randomized control trial looks when you're rolling it out to 1,800 plus schools, and what are your hopes and expectations at the end of that in terms of what we've just discussed, the usability, the end user, and the impact on hopefully the students?
Yeah, so the Mental Health in Primary Schools initiative is, I guess, an example of, beyond RCT. So, and that we weren't able to actually use an RCT approach whilst we were developing and testing that because we were working with government. So we could only use a quasi-experimental. So we had to find match controls and all that. But it does become a point in time where you've got enough evidence around, and we've built up a lot of evidence around outcomes. What are the impact outcomes? Where you don't have to keep doing RCTs forever more, essentially.
There's a diminishing returns on the value they're adding to the discussion.
Yeah, so that's kind of the point we are with that, is that we've got really robust studies, that we've got outcomes that are 1 or 2 years in the making, and that everything looks like it's quite positive. It then becomes a focus for us over the next few years is around fidelity and implementation. So we know what...
In terms of fidelity, getting into that notion of how the teachers bringing this training to bear upon their students in the classroom.
Yeah, exactly. So we have evidence of what good looks like, and now we need to ensure that good continues, essentially.
And this is what you were saying earlier about the removing yourself from the equation as a researcher. You've had almost what they call faded scaffolding, right? Where you've come in there with I wouldn't say heavy hand, but a lot of support for teachers, and then you've systematically removed yourself from the equation, and now they can run with these ideas on their own. And the fidelity is driven by them because they know the context and they know the students well. So in terms of the things that teachers are that you're training them to do, can you give us a bit of a sneak preview of what that entails? And if I was to give advice to some of the teachers listening in, or pre-service teachers that are listening into this podcast, give them this little introduction to the training package that they might be able to implement in their classroom experiences.
Yeah, the first one that I would think about is having a good common language, and that this is really can be driven by the context that you're working in. So how do teachers and students and families talk about mental health? So what terms are they comfortable with? What terms aren't they comfortable with? Because you want to ensure that when a teacher's talking to a family, the family understands the terms that are being used, and vice versa, as well as when you're talking to your colleagues, that you want to be able to them say, if you say a word, they know exactly what you mean. So a lot of times it's around finding what's the common language that the schools use. And that with different cultural groups, certain terms won't be as acceptable. And that's where part one is, how do we even talk about mental health?
Did you have any cultural faux pas where that comes to mind, where there were certain emotions or language around emotions that was off limits?
Well, for some schools, just even saying the words mental health was not appropriate.
Wow.
That's
interesting. So that fascinates me.
Very simple terms that we would say, oh yeah, that's fine, aren't. And I was actually just listening to another podcast this morning where the author talked about contextual intelligence. And what they were talking about was, who's the person that knows the context the best?
Right.
And thinking about ensure that those people are part of the conversation. So that's fantastic. Where the teachers and families, let's find a common language. How do we talk about this? Would be one. The second part would be about just knowing your school and knowing where help can come from. So do you know where the local psychologists are in your area? Do you know the local GPs? Do you know actually which which GPs have really good family services, so that you can have those conversations with families and say, hey, I think Johnny needs some additional support. Here's a couple names of psychologists in the area that you might want to explore. You don't necessarily want to make recommendations, but you want to actually give them a resource saying, here are just some options and see where.
And the ball's in the court of the parent or carer to then act on that. But at least you've empowered them with the potential resources at their disposal.
Yeah, but then although you don't want to recommend, you might be able to go, actually, if you're from a certain cultural background or you speak a certain language, here's the list. But actually, I know that these three have someone that can speak your home language.
Right. Okay. So you're connecting them to, and this is about being culturally and contextually intelligent, which I like that term. You're getting a sense of who these people are, who their support systems are, and where the threads of compatibility are across that, the alignment of all of those things. And who better than the teacher to understand those things? It's a fantastic point.
Yeah, teacher, or I would say school. So I'm very much so, and I mentioned this earlier, is that when we don't want teachers to be able to do everything, we want them to have the resources to support their students the best way possible. And, that could be the principal or the school admin staff, could be the person that creates that resource, but then it's a tool that the teachers can use to engage with families when they need to.
Yeah, so different means to achieve the same end.
Yeah, I really do think we need to think about schools and take the focus on teachers and the pressure off teachers. It's really about schools and the structural schools to do that.
Well, this opens up another can of worms for another podcast discussion about teacher wellbeing, which we can talk about another time. But that's kind of what you're alluding to there, is that, if we put so much pressure on their backs, they're going to crumble under the weight of that.
Yeah, and I've got we've got a couple of papers coming in.
Just another project to add to the mix of a dozen.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I can't wait to read some of your work in that area. So with that, is there any other pieces to that puzzle, or is that the kind of main big ticket items that teachers should know about?
They're really the first structural things to consider. And I think in terms of teacher practice, it's really about looking at the way that you yourself manage your emotions and your reactions to those, and think about how does this relate to the way that students can do it. So are there modeling that you could be doing? Just really helping students understand that mental health is part of being human, and that sometimes you will need to go get additional professional health support, other times you don't, but there's always something that you potentially could be doing right there and then.
Yeah, and so the teacher's a powerful example in how a student comes to understand how to respond to potentially challenging emotions.
So, there's a lot of research showing the importance of teachers as the emotional climate of their classroom.
Yeah, I saw some fascinating stuff around the whole cortisol studies, which I'm sure you're aware of, where they were, and I hadn't seen too much beyond the subjective evaluations of stress in the classroom, but I saw a study that I think was on emotional contagion between teachers and students, and they looked at the stress levels of the teachers, subjectively speaking, so self-reported stress levels of teachers, and then they looked at the students' stress levels, and then they took the cortisol through the saliva. Cortisol being a measure that coincides with the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, our stress response to acute stress. And so the markers in the saliva were showing that when the teacher got stressed, the students also got stressed. And so there's this pretty tight correlation. I can't remember the actual numbers between those two things. So the teachers being the emotional thermostat to the classroom is a pretty interesting suggestion, but it's like that whole idea of with great power comes great responsibility. And if they've got their hands on that emotional climate control, it's a pretty big responsibility, pretty big shoes to fill.
And it's really hard to care for others if you're not well yourself or caring for yourself.
100%. Yeah. There's plenty of analogies about getting the oxygen mask on yourself if the plane goes into free fall before you start trying to rescue others around you. So let's get stuck into these last questions and freestyle it, see how we go.
Sure.
So ready for this final section of the podcast. Part that I like the most. Big questions, little answers. So here's a challenge for you. Answer these questions in a sentence or two. And we'll start with the purpose of education. So finish the sentence. the purpose of education is?
To ensure every child becomes a lifelong learner that can critically engage with their world and live fulfilling lives.
Beautiful. The most important change that teachers can make to improve their teaching is?
To really accept that continuous improvement. So it's okay to be wrong, but it's what you do next is really important for the outcomes of your students.
Oh, this ties into John Hattie's work saying the best teachers are also great students. They learn from their mistakes, always ready to change and adapt. Love it. Next question. Biggest strength of our teaching profession is?
Everyone is passionate and just really cares for their students, and that we need to enable them to fulfill that goal.
Yeah. I don't think there's a shortage of goodwill amongst the teaching community, is there? We just need to empower them more. The most important work being done in the field of educational research, which is your wheelhouse, is?
I would say everything. I think that
You don't want to be biased here about your own work?
I think the more we learn about what good practice could and should look like, every piece of information that helps us understand our students better and what supports they need, I think that all adds to the field. And that regardless of the type of research that comes from, as long as it's quality research, it's more pieces of the puzzle that we know and that we can use.
Well said from a research egalitarian there. Excellent. Very diplomatic. Okay, next question. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be doomed.
If we keep doing the same thing over and over again, we will be doomed.
This speaks to your constantly improving, your mantra around constantly improving. And that's not going to happen if we're on a hamster wheel, is it?
No.
Okay. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be a huge success.
If we keep innovating, but also willing to fail and learning from that, then we will be a huge success. We need to be a continuous learning profession.
Love it. Couldn't agree more. Okay, you're the king of the castle now. If I had $1 billion to spend on improving the educational sector, I would spend it on
rethinking the role of schools and education as a whole. So thinking about what's missing, what could be there, and who's the best person to provide that to students.
There is the notion of working in the system, then there's the notion of working on the system. You seem to be thinking about both of those simultaneously. So that's it. You got some real bandwidth in your brain, I tell you. Okay, so the most important habit a graduate teacher can learn is?
Persistence. You're not going to know everything on day one. You won't know everything by the time you retire.
Always learning, always improving, always persisting in that. It's great. Again, couldn't agree more. We are aligned to the core. Okay, so here's one in your wheelhouse. The most important practice a teacher can do to improve the well-being of their students is?
To improve their own well-being first.
Yep, well said. Turn that one around. Fantastic. Okay, so the most meaningful change a school or educational leader can make to improve the learning outcomes and or the well-being of their students is?
Controversially, to not accept that they are the experts, but to really wanting to continuously engage in the evidence and ensuring that whatever their school does is in line with what the needs of their students are.
Okay.
Being agile and responsive.
That word agility got thrown around a lot during the pandemic, so I have some post-traumatic stress with that word, but I hear what you're saying. I understand what you mean by that. Being responsive to our students, if that shapes our agenda, that's great. Okay, final question. The most significant influence a person has had on my career is?
Pushing me to always challenge myself, not being afraid to question what I'm doing and to ask the hard questions.
Very good. Now it's reflected in your constant improvement in what you're doing, and it's reflected in the incredible accomplishments you've made in your career at such a young age and stage of your career. And again, as I mentioned from the outset, you've been an inspiration to me and provided a good model for me as a educational researcher. So thanks for your time, John. I'm not going to push my luck anymore. I really appreciate it. Let's do this again soon.
You are definitely overselling what I do. So.
There's the humble pie again. Very good. I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Associate Professor John Quach as much as I did. Upon reflecting on our conversation, there were at least 4 things that really stood out to me and frankly fascinated me. The first was about the value-neutral aspect of our emotions. The second was about the challenges of school transition periods. The third was about the complex nature of stressful experiences. And the fourth was about the need for a whole school approach to be used when attempting to foster mental health and well-being in educational settings. So let me briefly summarise each of these points in turn. The first is this idea of value neutrality for emotions. All emotions are okay. They don't hold inherent value per se, nor do they automatically suggest either virtue or vice. Rather, as John was mentioning, it's how you respond to emotions that determines their value, and in turn, the ethical dimension of emotions comes from that response. Identifying and responding to emotions is a great skill for students to develop, but it starts with teachers modelling good practices in this domain. And the other point there is they don't need the academic jargon or the clinical terminology nested around that emotional framework. John was mentioning that they simply need to have a common language between the students, the parents, the community, and themselves. The second point was about transition periods and the difficulty they pose to some students throughout their schooling experience. Now, in these transition periods, it may be helpful to some extent for students to experience the challenge of losing friends, but also the joy of making new ones, of being anxious and learning how to regulate that anxiety and to manage those emotions. Some exposure to challenge is helpful, but it's also true that for some students, these transition periods can become overwhelming and their function can become negatively influenced, such as sleep loss or social reclusion or diminished self-esteem and self-concept. And those vulnerable students are the ones that we need to identify and flag early on for additional supports and resources so that we can help buttress them through these difficult transition periods and help them weather that storm. Another point that was really interesting to me, which came off the back of the points John was making about the challenges of transition periods in childhood and adolescence, was based on Harvard's Center for the Developing Child. John mentioned that they have a model that helps us distinguish between healthy and unhealthy forms of stress. The first of these was toxic stress, which may involve things like exposure to violence, drug and alcohol abuse, or trauma. This form of stress can have dire consequences for a developing child and the adolescent brain. In contrast, there's also positive stress, which may involve stressful life events, such as doing a test, playing competitive sport, or writing an essay. These things are indeed stressful, but unlike toxic stress, which depletes our resilience and leads to acopia, positive stress can actually help develop the resilience and coping skills of our students so that they're better equipped to handle similar life stresses in the future. The third and final form of stress that John mentioned was the tolerable form of stress, which may be positive or negative depending on how well supported the child is throughout those experiences. Now, this isn't to say that tolerable stresses are easy to handle or that we should invite them into our lives. They're not easy by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, John used the example of the death of a family member, which can be the most difficult period in a child's life. But it does not have to become a toxic stress experience for the child's life if they are given the right supports to carry them and to shield them throughout that hardship. John mentioned some reassuring things to do for a child in that kind of situation. These include things like providing a strong role model so that they can journey with the child and demonstrate how to respond well under such circumstances. Another thing was giving the child permission to feel sad and blue and acknowledging the difficulty of the situation and validating their feelings rather than ignoring them or even telling them to just simply get over it. In these moments in a child's life, in these dark moments, the notion of validation can become an opening point, a sliding door moment, John said, so that you can help give advice to that student, help them accept the situation and to move on with better coping skills into the future in case they encounter anything just as drastic and just as dark in the future. The final point that John made that really struck me and got me thinking was this idea of a school-wide approach to developing mental health and well-being in schools. I mean, I think so much emphasis is put on individual teachers in schools as if they're the knights in shining armor, as if they're a superhero who can do all things and not crumble under the pressure. However, John was mentioning that when we have problems that are distributed throughout the system of the school, in relation to, say, the mental health and well-being of our students, we need a system-wide, a whole school approach to solving those problems and improving the health and well-being of students. Now, he's looked at this program across 1,800 schools in Australia. It's the largest program of its kind, at least in my country, Australia. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that experience. He's pointed to 3 things that underpin the structural aspects of their health and well-being programs in primary or elementary schools. The first of those is to share a common language about mental health. Now, he talked about this notion of cultural or contextual intelligence as a good way to identify how to frame discussion around mental health and well-being in schools, because it does tend to be highly contextualized to the needs and nuances of the community. John used the example of how some schools preferred not to use the term mental health at all, and instead opt for less threatening terms like well-being or wellness. And that common language and the contextual intelligence that goes along with that common language helps to create a much higher level of fidelity between the needs of the students and the supports that we're able to put in place for them. The second aspect of the program is modelling mental health. And this is for teachers, for students, for the whole school to be able to model mental health by managing their own emotions, thinking about how their emotional self-regulation's going and their own self-care, and how it might be perceived by others, such as from a teacher's perspective, how they're managing their emotions and how those students are interpreting their management of those emotions, because it can have a big influence on those students. We talked about this notion of an emotional thermostat, and the teachers have their hands on that emotional thermostat. So it's a big opportunity and a big moment of influence in the lives of learners there. The third aspect of the program is about knowing where health can come from. For example, John prompted the question, do you know where the local psychology and mental health services are closest to the school? Do you know which of those places share the language and the culture of the people that you're referring there? Now, John was quick to emphasise that we must be careful to take the focus off teachers and instead place it on to their mental health and wellbeing services, both within and across the school community. Because this seemingly subtle shift in emphasis suggests that such challenges are best considered at the system-wide level, and it does not necessarily begin and end with individuals per se. The systemic mechanisms in place that schools have a handle on are more than the sum of their parts, and mental health and wellbeing can arise at multiple levels of that system. Now that's about all we have time for in today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the release of upcoming content or support this program, I'll include links in the show notes. Until next time, may you continue to learn powerfully.